Welcome to this episode of Level with Emily Reese. This is part 2 of a conversation I had with scntfc, also known as Andy Rohrmann, about his music for Oxenfree and Oxenfree 2. The first game, Oxenfree, came out in 2016, and the second is from July of this year, 2023. I love both these games so very much. They're both coming-of-age stories. The first is about a group of high school kids having a party on a beach. And the second game, the characters are a little bit older. They're young adults, probably in their late 20s, maybe. And they're just young adults trying to carve a path through life. Central to both of these games is the radio. Radio waves and transmissions through time loops. This gave Andy so many opportunities to do really fun things with music, and some of them are just so meta. So in Oxenfree 2, as you can listen to music on your little portable radio, and you may stumble across a station where the DJ is a man named Morgan Cooley. Well, Morgan Cooley is the uncle of Ren, who is a main character in the first game. So in the second game, you hear Morgan Cooley on the radio. He even says hi to his nephew, which is very, very cool. But Morgan Cooley is, or maybe isn't, an alter ego of scntfc, of Andy Rohrmann, in real life. Like if you go to Bandcamp, there are more Morgan Cooley albums on Bandcamp, and one of them is a quote-unquote collaboration with scntfc. So I just love all the layers of reality that are blurred through this. And Andy and I talk quite a bit about Morgan Cooley a little bit later in this part of the chat. And if you listen to the audio version of the podcast, you'll hear some of that music as well. There's never enough time to talk with Andy about his music, and again, the games are just so great. I took out some of the larger spoilers, but I can't guarantee there aren't others, so if you haven't played the games yet and you want to do that, then come back and listen to these chats with Andy. They're both so good. Join us on Discord. That link is down in the show notes. Chat with us about this and other episodes. If you can support us financially, head over to Patreon, patreon.com/level. And of course, sign up for us here on YouTube. Subscribe and get notifications, all those things, so you don't miss any of our new videos. And it is important to note that we don't put music in these videos for copyright reasons and many other reasons as well, but copyright being the main. So do listen to the audio podcast. There's a lot of music in this episode. I mean, that's kind of how we roll. So, what we start off talking about here in this conversation, Night School, the studio that makes Oxenfree and Oxenfree 2, they did a bunch of ARG stuff, actually around both games. And so we start off talking about some of the ARG things that the studio did about Oxenfree 2. All right, here's Andy Rohrmann, a.k.a. scntfc, or is it scntfc, a.k.a. Andy Rohrmann, talking about Oxenfree and Oxenfree 2 Lost Signals.
Did you follow the ARG lead up or any of the parentage stuff we did at all?
I heard about it late. But yeah, no, I didn't. But I know you did some ARG stuff. Did you do it out somewhere on an island out in Seattle, right?
Yeah, so that was the first ARG. Yeah, so it culminated in players, real live humans, going to a real live place and digging up a music box that I built. Amazing. But for ARG for this, we didn't want to get into the logistics of scavenger hunt and just wanted to do more like lore stuff. So we really dug into what the cult was.
Parentage, the cult in the game, yeah.
Yeah. So we did a lot of thought and work on what that is, but we had at some point a little epiphany. So one of our writers was like, well, in this history of this group, they had a piece of music. And this again is me riffing on what writers do. So the script is just like music plays and then just lyrics. And so I was thinking about the lyrics, and I was like, well, it's kind of sing-songy. I have to figure out something for this. And then it dawned on me that the lyrics fit in a piece of music that already existed, which is in Oxenfree 1. This is actually a great segue. Oxenfree 1 is called Lost, and it is the music that Jonas's mother sings to him when he's a kid.
Yes.
And that's all we kind of know about it. He's like, we hear it, and he says, "Oh yeah, this is crazy. This is the song my mom sang to me when I was a little kid." So we went back and repurposed that to be the melody that this parentage cult, their song is based on. So that's in the, if you go back, if you look on, Night School's Twitter, I think all the videos are there, but you'll hear it in these videos. So that's kind of a cheeky, kind of mean in a way, because people do like the song and know it, but we're like, haha, it turns out that maybe Jonas's mother was a member of this cult, and the reason she knows this song is it's something they sang. So yeah, we revised our own history with that. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. Doesn't appear on the soundtrack, but is a really good connecting point between Oxenfree 1 and Oxenfree 2.
Yeah, it's very cool. Very cool. You do, in the second game, the puzzles, what did you call the magnetic puzzle?
The magnetophone?
The magnetophone in the second game. In the first game, they're like reel-to-reel tape machines, right? That you have set up.
First game, they're magnetophones. In the second game, what? Do they ever refer to them?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. We just called them time loop puzzles, I think.
Okay.
Because they have a cool name. But yeah, the oscilloscope, yeah, little dial thing. Uh-huh.
Yep. That's in the second game, right? And then, the first game has the tape machines. And you called them what?
Magnetophone?
Magnetophone. How do I not know that? How do I not know what that is?
I can't remember either. But that idea came up. So one of the things we've done in both games, but I think the stuff that manifested most easily in Oxenfree 1 was like, okay, we got a radio. What can we do with it? And so I'd already come up with tuning portals, but I had a bunch of pitches for things we could do puzzle related with audio. And one of them essentially was like turntables. What if we can speed up and slow down music, and then to solve the puzzles to like match it, like a DJ matches beats and tempo. So that's how that started. And it was even, I was like, what if you could like turn a thumbstick and that's speed up or slow down. So to get it going, you have to match. So yeah, that's how the magnetophone came to be. And then the music then is 3 layers. Then a bunch of trickery to make it all work together and sync up.
Mm-hmm.
And then, then I did not come up with the idea for the puzzles in Oxenfree 2, but it's like a more integrated version of that, because it is audio and now visuals as well, to get these kind of different axes to come together and mesh.
Yeah. I remember the first time I realized that the music that was stuck in my head one day was from the reel-to-reel puzzle in the first game, and I just started laughing because it's such funny, quirky, kind of like crooked music, right? I mean, it's just this weird, I don't know. Tell me about writing it, because like you said, you had to write it in 3 parts that you could independently manipulate to make them line up, which was so cool. The first time I did it, I was like, oh, what a fun idea, So I loved it. And the music.
So the basis of that is just Beacon Beach, and then like covering it in like, as best I could with limited budget and means, like what would it sound like if it was like, if you heard of Longines Symphonette. I don't even know what the origin of it is. It's mentioned in a Tom Waits song, but it's kind of like the pre-Muzak, or like what's the guy, the public television, Lawrence Welk. It's just like saccharine, like shallow music from I think 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Like post-war optimism, but it resulted in just the most boring music, covers of things, but they would do it just sappy. So I was like, well, I want the plucky strings and like, as light and dumb as it can possibly be, as if it's something you would hear, not necessarily World War II, but this is maybe a little later. So I covered it with orchestral elements, and then just split it into parts that seemed to be the most logical to hear separately and then to pitch up and down until the player could understand. So there's a lot of trickery in that, and this is even broader for like adaptive music in games I've worked on where we have to have separate layers. It's like they all have to work together, but they still have to have some sort of logic or sense when heard separately. And a lot of stuff doesn't. So this is kind of the under the hood stuff that a lot of people don't get about scoring for video games, and that makes it so difficult. Is we can't just like write 3 minutes of music and expect that that's what the player will hear or the listener will hear from beginning to end. We have to have all these contingencies about comprehension. So say we have I don't know, let's say a bass part that is very overt with its rhythm, and you get that, oh, this is the one, bum 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 bum, and then you put something more syncopated on top that doesn't start on the one, it's like boom, ba da da dum da 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 da. If you don't have that overt rhythm underneath, and you just say, here's this syncopated part, you can't identify. It's much more difficult to identify where it starts. So the listener is like kind of let loose, or even if you're not starting, you don't have a root note that's really obviously saying this is in this key. If you're let loose from key and rhythmically from where it starts, it can be a mess or confusing to the listener.
Sure.
So that's something I have to take into account with different layers and things that can drop in or out, is always making sure like that the player, the listener, understands at least the rudiments of what's going on musically, so that their brain slots things in correctly.
Sure.
It's like back before video games, when I just made music for me, I'd play with these things intentionally. Like, it's funny that this bass line seems like one thing, but when the drums come in, you realize, oh, it was not even in the same, it's like 3/4 versus 4/4, and then you're like, oh, I get it now. Like, some stuff in video games is so quick, you don't have that opportunity. So this isn't a specific example, but this is like what it would be like. It's like, well, if we have 4 layers of different instruments and they can all come in and out at any time, we have to make sure that every single one plays the one, so that no matter what the player's hearing, they understand the rhythm. Like, oh, I get that, and when the next part will come in now, and they'll just better comprehension of what's happening musically.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's something that like we have to consider constantly, and even time-wise, like phrasing. Like, well, if we stop this after like 1.5 bars, that's bad. So we have to like let it play to 2 or 4 or whatever is most logical in terms of phrasing to move to the next part, so the player doesn't get, unless it's intentional, they do not get, out of balance, I guess, with what's supposed to be happening.
Yeah, I noticed that in a few of your tracks where you kind of, maybe like halfway through the tune, I'll be like, oh wait, what happened to the downbeat? I thought it was here. And we talked about when we did this thing, it was like a month ago, where we were just listening to some of your tracks together on YouTube, myself and Sam, who mixes the show. And we just literally, I hadn't heard any of the soundtrack. And so we're just like, pick a number, let's listen to a track. And I wish I remember now, because I heard it in the game. I just didn't, I wish I would have made a note about it. But there's one in particular, I'll find it for the podcast, for the final product. But we both of us were really into that. We love that. We're like, for a minute there, I thought it was here. But now I'm like, wait, is that beat 2 instead of beat 1? Or is that beat 1 and instead of beat 1? Or, yeah, that's pretty great.
I'm time signatures and whatnot, obviously a ton in prog rock, but I'm a very specific sort of nerd from the, I guess, early 2000s. It's like there was a lot of electronic music that got really brainy, like probably in an unfun way for a lot of people. I really, really liked it, like this kind of, and a lot of it was based around like remixing rap songs in, not necessarily weird intentionally, but just kind of very experimental ways. There's this band called Funkstörung who did Wu-Tang Clan remix, and
Okay.
it was official. And the word I had heard was RZA heard it and was just like, "What is this trash?" Okay, but put it on a record. And a lot of that style of music I really love, and a lot of it plays with really upsetting, like normal rhythmic conventions. Yeah, offline I could send you links to some of the stuff. And I was even like DJing it. So I was DJing some weird
Wow.
skittery music. And in my best attempt to like get people like, hey, what do you think of this? And a lot of times that's unsuccessful. I guess the most famous examples would be this has close crossover with like um like late 90s like Aphex Twin and Square Pusher and things like that. That's more on the drum and bass frenetic
Yeah.
end of things, while I was more in the slower down tempo things, or DJ Shadow, things like that. There's a few DJ Shadow remixes that get really, really cool and rhythmically complex. But it's a lot of that influence. It's like from way, way back. I've always just really appreciated that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would love to see a little mini playlist of some of that stuff, or listen to it anyway. So I'll bug you about that later for sure. There's a track in the first which comes back in the second. It's called, in the first game, it's called Clean Slate. I think all one word. And then in the second, it's, I think, Cleaned Slate. I think is how, something like that. And what I love about this is the melody is like a perfect little loop, right? So, and I remember in our last conversation, because I listened to it again, I didn't otherwise remember this from a year ago, but you say in there how much you love loops. It's when we're talking about writing in a major key, interestingly enough, but you also talk about how you love loops. And I just wondered, like in a, you know, with a melody like the one that happens in Clean Slate, where it does just perfectly loop back to itself, is that a challenge you presented yourself? Was it a happy accident? Was it a little of both? I mean, do you remember?
I don't. Not only do I not, the updated version was part of those early experiments with like, hey, what can I bring back from
Okay.
Oxen? And one of the easiest things, accidentally one of the easiest things, like I mentioned, this game isn't neither of these games is scoring like themes for a character, and it's more about vibes. That means when I go back to something, I can say, oh, well, I can use this because it's not somebody's theme that's not in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one of the ones where I was just like, I'm just going to fiddle with this. I'm going to kind of revise it and see where it goes and if it could work. And if it does and it gets to Oxenfree 2, then it's a great trigger for players to like, oh, I kind of recognize that. But also, you know, it just makes that connection between the two, because that was and it's somewhat overt point of all of this was that the two games are closer together than it could seem. So obviously, like, characters came back, Alex comes back, even the rest of it's in a low-key way. And another thing we did in the lead up to Oxenfree 2 was we actually made radio stations and put them in Oxenfree 1. So the parentage teens, so Violet, Olivia, and Charlie, are now in Oxenfree 1.
They are?
Yes. So this happened very low key, and we hinted at players, like, I think we did videos where we hinted at a location on Edwards Island and a radio frequency. And so these were content updates that did not exist in the game,
Okay.
that then players could go visit and get. And this was a year or a year and a half before Oxenfree 2 came out. You get to hear these characters and be like, who the hell is this? This is weird. And kind of, you know, we wanted to stoke the fires of what's happening in Oxenfree 2, but it works in this mythology because it's all about time loops. So there's really no reason those can't exist in the Oxenfree 1 like time frame. So yeah, and so again with music, kind of that same thing. It's like kind of mining and remixing, just to provide some stronger connections that aren't necessarily like, here's Alex, here's your theme, and more just like we're hearing broadcasts. We're just like we're intercepting what we're hearing, and it's something that's like floating around the environment. I've always called it ghosts for no better way to put it, but like the island's haunted and this is the stuff that's there. So no matter when, even if you were in between games and were able to go to the island and turn on a radio, you'd hear this stuff.
Wow. Yeah. If you haven't played the first, there is quite a startling, well, there are a number of startling things that happen, but the end, yeah, because listen, I don't play a lot of games that are like scary, and I wouldn't call this like a Friday Night at Freddy's or anything like that, but it's, it's spooky, and especially in the second, there's a jump scare that consistently has gotten me. But those are kind of few and far between. It's more just the concept of like, being caught in this terrible, awful, version of a purgatory where you're repeating time. And so, some of those things are very horrific. But the ending of the first one was something that stuck with me. I would think about like that very last line of that first game so often. I'd be like, oh my God, just that empty feeling that you get from thinking that thought, just like, oh my God. And then, I don't know, I found that to be such a great way to end the game, just to force me to, well, you didn't even force me to it, just, it really stuck with me and made me think over and over again. Because I thought I got the good ending, right? And I did. I think I did still, but to no avail, which is pretty powerful.
Yeah, and it's something, and I agree. And going even back to what you mentioned about jump scares, like, there's horror in that sense of jump scares and ooh and gore and blood. And we do some of that, and almost kind of in a ha-ha way of like, oh, we got to throw in a couple. Gotcha. But there are deeper things that to me are scarier. And this deals with a lot of them, which is like not just memories and what those are for reality, but also then like, well, what if things were different, or I did this differently and made this choice, and like that's scary stuff. Like walk down the wrong side of the street, now never would have met my wife. Like that kind of thing is way more terrifying than blood horror. And so that's something we really got to play with, and I think is very in both games, and is very effective of making those choices more overt, like with Michael, and what if she could bring him back, that sort of thing. And then that tied with the more personal existential thing of like, well, the same shit's just happening over and over.
Ad nauseum.
That is much more emotionally effective for me. Like I always think, and people have interpreted it differently, but the end of The Graduate, I think one of the smartest things I've ever seen is, I'm assuming you've seen The Graduate or remember?
Oh, yes.
Steals her from the altar and like, haha, woo, ah. But the last thing is them getting on the bus and everybody looking at him, and they're all like, and then they kind of go, and then they get right immediately to this like, well, just like malaise, and it's so sad because it's supposed to be this like triumphant moment, and they do such a good job of being like, not really.
Yeah.
Now it's so yeah, I really, really like those sorts of feelings. And so to play with that in those two ways, I think, with like, oh, what if I could, or this slight little difference could make such a big difference in the way reality plays out, or being trapped there also is terrifying as well. Glad you like the end. But yeah, it's just one of the things that it really reflects in the music, is just like, that's the stuff I find most fascinating or interesting, and not to bag on, more character centric things. And this is, I think, why the Night School writers are so good, is they can abstract them So even beyond just like, oh, I identify with this character, there's things that are just like extremely impactful because they're stated so universally.
Yeah.
Like Riley and her dad talking about why her mom was gone was like, that never happened to me, but I'm like, totally understand the emotional weight of that because it's written so well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I appreciated so much about the games, both games too, is you're getting the sense from each character that everyone has trauma. Like everyone has faced tragedy or is facing tragedy or will face tragedy. And so you get glimpses into everybody's struggle and understanding that you want to help everyone and you can't. And, that's something you especially explore as the big twists and turns happen in the second game of, okay, how can everyone win? And you're like, well, what do you mean by win, right? And so I really like that. And I think that's one reason why someone like me, who's 46 years old, could relate so well with the high school kids in the first game, because they're all dealing with awful things or difficult things, maybe not necessarily awful, but difficult things, some of them awful, and trying to also figure out how to relate to other people just in real life while you're carrying this baggage,
Yeah. And it's like the conversation Riley has with her own son at different points in her life, but from her perspective in the game, like, oh, well, it's all new to her, but like the older version of him kind of saying like, well, you fucked up, but that's okay, is like,
yeah,
again, like nobody's gonna have that experience, at least not now. Time traveling children coming back, like you're a bad mom, but more broadly, they just have a ton of impact because there's something relatable. And again, I think that's even one of the impressive things with the move from teen protagonists to adult protagonists, like late 20s, I guess we'd say. And that shift on the surface may seem crazy. Oh, you're going from young adult to like adult. Like, how are people going to follow you? And it's like, well, if you treat them, with respect and the themes are universal enough, it'll work. And like, I think this is a really successful example of that. It's like, it's well written enough and impactful enough that it becomes universal and nobody's going to be like mad that, well, the teen, they're too old, or even the teens in this one are too young, or I don't get it anymore. It's like, if it's universal enough, it doesn't matter.
Right. One of the other universal things is how, because there are, as we've talked, teens in the second game too, but the main characters are the ones who are older in their upper 20s or whatnot, and how those younger kids in the second game, everyone who's not their age is just old. Right? It doesn't matter that they're only like 26 or 28 or whatever. They're like, no, you're like 40 something. And I remember that, not really having a sense for how old adults are. And I just love that because it really, it's like cracking through the facade of what a teenager wants to be. They want to be the grown up. They want to be the adult, but they can't because they can't see anyone as the age they are or whatever. Yeah.
This is very brief, but the funniest example I have of that is when my nieces, when they were like 3 or 4, I was babysitting and they called me old, and I was like, oh, I am old. How old am I? And they thought for a minute, and one of them said, oh, old, like 8. Yeah, the perspective of like,
right?
Word perspective, everything's just collapsed. Like, oh, she thought of the biggest number she could, 8. And I'm 8.
Well, let's talk about I know we've been going at it for a bit here, and I again just appreciate your generosity with your time. Some of the specific tracks in Oxenfree the first, of course, we have to talk about Epiphany Fields. It's like, it's just iconic, right? I mean, and one of the things we talked about the darker opening for the second game, and you mentioned how the first game doesn't start like that, but we didn't really say the first game starts basically kind of like a party sort of. You're like trying to get a party going, so there's that energy of like, oh my gosh, we told our parents we're at each other's houses, and now we're on this beach on this island, and we're gonna have this all nighter, and we're drinking beer by the fire and fucking around with an old radio and opening time loops. But I mean the beginning, there's just that energy which I really love, and as you mentioned, you kind of carry that through into the and I think Epiphany Fields captures that really well too, even though we're kind of past that by then. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that I think I mentioned earlier, and what's so weird is that was off the cuff. We need a song for Ren's band. Right. And so what would Ren be into? Kind of like, I guess if I identify with anybody in this game, kind of like me, like he would be into music that's cooler than everybody else. Even though everybody thinks he's a nerd, he likes the cool stuff. And I think at that time I was like, oh, it'd probably be like, like kind of dreamy pop music like Toro y Moi or Washed Out. And so I was just like, okay, now I gotta, in 20 minutes, make some like, I forget, was that Vaporwave? I forget if there was a word for it even at the time. It's been so long, it's like 10 years. But I was like, I'm just gonna make one of those types of songs. And so heavy sidechain compression and some ooh-ah vocals and then I was like, okay, done. So that Toey, and then Baby Carrots was the one I was like, well, what if they are doing more than like synths on a computer, and they play real instruments, or they try once, thanks to Morgan Cooley loaning in some instruments or whatever. So yeah, started, and then I think Sean or Bryant or someone at night school was like, oh no, this is too cool to just throw on the radio. Like, we want to put this in the game. And so both of those other two songs ended up in the game as score. And it was like really worked out well, because then it is perfectly setting the tone. Unlike Oxenfree 2's start, like Oxenfree 1, people don't know what they're really getting into. So having it be like, haha, kind of teen fun time fit perfectly.
Yeah.
That was
I love that. Yeah, and Toey Grove as well. You kind of mentioned being of that ilk.
So I tried to have the underpinnings of what's going on in this game influence the music as much as possible. So the most obvious is like everything sounds ratty and shitty because it's all like radio broadcasts, old tape recorders. Mm-hmm. It's an idea that somebody I worked with planted in me a long time ago, was that something I had done. He said it's it's nostalgic to me, but I could never tell you what or what time or era. It's just hitting that.
Sure.
So it's like that drove a lot of this, was like, well, I want it to be it's not supposed to be all old cassettes. It's supposed to be everything. Time loop time, essentially from the Canelo disaster through whatever the present day is, all of that. And so I was even doing like glitchy loops and MP3 compression and things, and they just didn't end up fitting quite right. But that was the idea. Okay. So one of the things that ended up being just not sonic texture, but was the idea of like, something that's old or a part of time is like now slowed down mush, because it's a 78 and you can only play it at 33 or something like that.
Yeah.
So a specific example that I do remember, because it's so overt, is from Oxenfree 1 is Against the Rocks and Against the Waves, where and this is just like, I just played this little piano thing, made a little loop, and then Against the Waves is just that pitched down an octave or two, playing really, really slowly, dun, 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 and then me writing new stuff on top of that. So I like the word recursive, and there's so much definition sonically in music, but I was like, what if I kept doing that? What if then I, slowed it down even more, and then slowed it down again and wrote new stuff and just kept doing that? Like, is it possible? to do that infinitely, kind of like a fractal.
Yeah.
Um, in ways, sure, but also in ways, no, because you get to the point where the sonic definition of, 44,000 samples per second or 96 even, you know, you've gotten down to inaudible ranges really quickly. So it's just
Sure.
gone.
Yeah.
Did use a lot of that even in the ARG and when I was doing puzzles and things was just
Okay.
like, here's this song. And if you quadruple the speed, you'll realize that there was Morse code playing. It was just so low that you couldn't, it's not audible when you're playing at normal speed, but you speed it up and it's like 4 minutes long. Now it's like 2 seconds and it says something in Morse code.
Wow.
I did a lot like that. So getting back to melodies and things was those ideas of, and this actually, I do this, is it To the Summit? Where,
Love that one.
so yeah, okay. This is actually, whatever, clean slate. This is the best example of this.
Good.
Your melody degrades, but not like a tape. The actual, like, it's like you remember a melody. So every time it plays through, there's one less note until it's just one note left. So that's
Okay.
the idea of a loop, time loop, or a tape loop. But instead of, sonic quality, it's literally remembering the notes that are played. And it is just like, okay, now, this time there were 8, now there's 7, now there's 5, and now there's just 1. And that's like the last note of that piece.
Nice.
Yeah, that's probably the most literal example of that sort of thing coming into play where the ideas for the game have affected not even just the recording or production process, but the actual songwriting.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was also curious well, actually doesn't necessarily come from me. This comes from the same patron I was mentioning at the early outset where he kind of noticed it was not quite as melodic, whatever. But he's lives up in the PNW, Pacific Northwest, and was very curious how that landscape did affect you musically, because the landscape is like totally what the game is about, right? You're traversing this pretty harsh landscape, this Pacific Northwest, craggy, mountainous, harsh, musty, dewy, foggy world. So yeah,
Yep.
how did that affect the music for you?
It's huge and was before I knew what the game was. When Sean at night school got in touch and was like, would you be interested in scoring this? And they showed me the first bits. I was like, oh yeah, that's easy. And it was because like I know what this place sounds like to me.
Yeah.
And looks like and feels like I've done a lot of camping. I like to hike, so I do spend time absorbing the the Cascadian, like especially on this side of the Cascades. The west side is kind of perpetual like gray. Uh
Mm-hmm.
and you get up in the mountains enough, like way wetter than it actually is in like Seattle. Not dumping rain, but just like everything's
Right.
covered in moss.
Mm-hmm.
Uh and just perpetually just kind of like foggy um and it just fit. So I like that was the one thing was like the demos for Oxenfree 1 was just like writing to that vibe before knowing characters or story or anything, and then a lot of that ended up in the game just because it's like, well, this is what it I guess sounds like. uh,
Yeah.
the artist Heather on Oxenfree 1 is from the area as well, and so
Okay.
we were already in tune. So when night school's like, we want to do something in the Northwest, we already had it in our blood.
Mm-hmm. Did you grow up there? I can't remember if we talked about that last time.
Born, I think we did. Born in Minneapolis, but moved here really early. So I've been in
Okay.
the North since I was 3 years old.
Yeah. Have you been back to Minneapolis?
I once I did a show there. I did a rescore. A friend and I were invited to a a film slash music festival where we rescored film. So we did like a live weird electronic score. And I think that's the only time I've been back. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll have to think of ways to get you here. Get you to come say, hey, hang out in the Minneapple for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I remember just being fascinated by how every single building downtown is connected by sky bridges. And I was like,
Skyways,
what?
yep.
I was there in summer and I was like, why? This was like, well, it's a little cold.
Yeah, come visit in January or February and you'll find out why. There was many years ago, I think 2018 maybe, I'd have to think now, the Super Bowl was here and we had just gotten a new stadium, which is how you get a Super Bowl, right? And I was just, because in February, which is when the Super Bowl is, it's usually the coldest time of year here, but you can have like normal winter days where it's like 25 or 30 degrees, but it was like 17 below. And I was so glad. I was like, now you people know what it's like to live here. All you people coming here for the Super Bowl, you get the actual true Minneapolitan experience of just how awful it is. Yeah.
Don't get nearly that cold here. You know,
right.
It's just all the time. It's never like torrential downpours or like crazy blizzards. It's just kind of just always kind of gray. Even now, it's the middle of summer, and I went out this morning. It was just kind of like mist, like damp northwest. But I love it. So
yeah. It's a beautiful area. Beautiful games, of course, and I mean, I felt like I could spend, several more weeks listening to all this music and playing the games over and over again and still uncovering, just like peeling the layers back and finding all the Easter eggs. What were some of your favorites that we haven't talked about? Are there any?
Well, yeah, I think kind of back to the ARG stuff and nothing overt, but that's just been really fun because it's like, I think the genesis of it was, as I mentioned earlier, we kind of jammed on puzzle ideas. And so I had like, oh, what if we did this audio thing? And it was a lot of audio-based trickery. But we really realized that if we put puzzles that are too difficult in the game, we'll trip up the narrative. Like, we didn't want it to be like, oh, this person's really loving the story, but then they got to this impossibly difficult puzzle where they had to decode whatever bullshit I made up. So we basically said we're not going to do that. So even the puzzles that are in are relatively simplified, so that they're interesting and intriguing, but it's not like a point where players would give up.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that.
Yes. And it was the smart choice. Yeah. So what we did, and we're like, well, we seem to have we planted the seed for an ARG in the game. And we thought, if it's not popular and nobody cares, we don't have to do anything. That's just it. There's some Morse code and it says something and that's that. But then when it took off and people got interested, then it was like, okay, well, let's do all that stuff. So the first example was, or the first thing to uncover, I believe, was that a song on Bandcamp, Beacon Beach, the melody is playing Morse code. So it's very slow. The melodic changes are very slow, so it's mostly rhythmic. So it was actually easy to get dots and dashes in. Da, 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 da. But on Bandcamp, you can change files, and outwardly facing, nobody knows. So everybody goes to download this song. I can then change the Morse code, and overtly you would ever notice. But if you're then tuned into this ARG stuff happening, we could change the message and send a different message. So again, we're playing with, time loops and temporal things, something that seems permanent. Oh, that song itself has changed. So that was kind of the start of that. And then we got to do all kinds of things with like phase cancellation. We got to the point where it was like, now there's like Morse code in either channel and it's backwards.
Oh my
But if you have
God.
tools, you can, just flip it around and listen to one channel only and decode that. So yeah, there was a lot. We got to play with a lot of that sort of thing, to the point where it was central to the ARG, not at all central to the games, but then just became kind of like, yeah, a fun Easter egg thing to do, to the point where there was a different sort of code hidden in one song from Oxenfree 2 that a couple people solved.
Oh
And
my
so
God.
like messaged me on Twitter with like what that secret message says, kind of like, haha, we found it. And it's been really fun to do that stuff, not having an ARG hinge on it. It's just kind of there for fun.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I think by now we're down to, in terms of like things to decode, there's still one code extant that nobody's figured out that's
Okay.
buried somewhere. So I'm still hoping they'll figure that, or we'll be able to put it to good use in the future if we decide to do more, I don't know, ARG-ish stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, and all of that, it's fun and it's kind of stupid, but it fits with the games. And so
Yeah.
that's your thing, is it's not just me like fucking around. It's not just
Right.
like, because I like codes. It's like, it's so much of it has to do with the narrative of these games, like the Kanaloa disaster and all the military stuff, and that Maggie Adler was up in this comm tower, like trying to sort all this stuff and transmitters. All of it kind of fits, and so it's totally appropriate
Yeah.
to stupid codes in music and break the fall. Like I mentioned, like kind of Morgan Cooley making an appearance in game then really blurs the lines between real and fake, because there's even I have a collaboration album with Morgan Cooley, and so if people really want to dig, it's like, well, where does it begin or end? It's like when you watch a movie and there's an actor in it and they reference some other movie that
Yeah.
they were somebody else was in. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
that's the kind of like, wait, you were in Game of Thrones and you just mentioned Game of Thrones. That's weird. Yeah, that's the thing where it just kind of gets too self-referential for its own good.
I can't wait to listen to that Morgan Cooley album.
Sure is a thing. That exists.
Yeah.
And predates Oxenfree by like 6 years, which is extra.
Morgan
just
Cooley predates Oxenfree?
Morgan Cooley was making music like in 2008, I think. And that was just something that existed out there. It was like, oh, we could work this in. Sure. Put him on the station.
So
He's
it's just an alter ego of yours.
Oh, maybe.
Maybe,
Maybe not.
maybe not. Okay. Well, I'll dig into that. That's amazing.
Hire
The
out.
thing, and it's not even just obviously the music, for those unfamiliar with Music Through the Hearts of Space, public radio show that's been on, I think, since the 70s. And it's the same dude who must be 922 years old by now. But that's the biggest piece of it, is the delivery of Morgan Cooley's DJ presence, right? Which I know a thing about, having been on radio most of my adult life. It's like, I have a voice and I don't intend to do it, but I do it. And I think Morgan Cooley probably talks like that in real life too, but just his delivery of just like, let's go. We've been on Earth for a while. I mean, it's just so like slow. It's like someone slowed him down, but that's just how he is. I loved that. You nailed it. It's great.
Thank you. That's the album. You can get again. Good song titles. But yeah, it's just a done thing that we managed to fit in from my past of just, and honestly, I will say totally, yeah, songs from the Hearts of Space, or Windham Hill, Mannheim Steamroller, all
Mannheim.
kind of like thing we all made fun of when I was little.
Oh, I loved it.
When I was in punk bands, I was like, oh, this is stupid shit. Ha 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 ha. Got into sampling, and all that stuff was like $1 in the dollar bin at record stores. And then I was like, well, actually, then it got really.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. I mean, what else? What else do you want to say?
Right now, I'm just going through stuff to send you.
Oh, good.
Like, there's Morgan Cooley, but there's also the thing that our collaborative project called Burn a Pale Fire, which is another wink wink reference if you know what Pale Fire is.
Okay.
You read that?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, it's a book?
Yeah, Nabokov. It's about...
Oh, God. Yeah, no, I have not read it.
It's about a writer who's obsessed with this poet who may or may not exist. So it's a book with the poem, but it's also the deconstruction of the poem all wrapped together, and the weird relationship between this writer and the writer he's obsessed with.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the heavy wink. I guess, yeah, it's House of Leaves-ish kind of thing, but about humans and not a house.
Good.
Yeah, just something that's been a dumb, fun thing to do. And it really is just coincidence that this ended up being part of Oxenfree lore.
Yeah.
Because we're pretty much just like, haha, wouldn't it be funny if... And then the game got popular. So, well, we thought it was funny that Morgan was referenced as Ren's uncle, and now it's like popular, so it's in the real world. So yeah, it's a fully ambient album that is me and Morgan.
Love it. That was one of the things that I like about Morgan saying hi to Ren on the air, because Ren being from one of the characters in the first game, and knowing that Ren is stuck in this loop, like, where is Ren? And how is Morgan, like, does Morgan know that Ren is stuck? Like, he's like, hi, Ren.
Could.
Yeah.
So yeah, part of lore is that Morgan was probably a member of Parentage, and so he might have been, in with the group that was manipulating portals and whatnot as well. So TBD, I think, the details.
Yeah.
But again, if we consider timelines and we pretend for a second that when we as players hear the radio in Oxenfree 2, we could be hearing a broadcast that's 15 years old.
Wow.
Like, that's one thing I really love. So obviously there's the interaction stuff, like Maria talking to Charlie. And obviously walkie stuff where Riley is actually conversing with people. But there's no reason for these radio broadcasts to have being in the same time period as within which we're hearing. Even I think if you listen to the whole baseball game broadcast, there's weird continuity stuff within, if you line them all up, and which somebody has, I've noticed on YouTube, somebody's been capturing all the radio stations and uploading them. There's weird discontinuity issues with that as well. So within this one, either, sub tiny little micro story within the Oxenfree universe, even within that, it's like a little like, wait a second, buddy, this doesn't all make sense.
Yeah, how are we in this inning? I seem to remember it being something like that in the first playthrough. Yeah.
Yeah. The self-awareness. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Such great stuff. And, I mean, the music I'll be listening to for the rest of my life. It's just great. I just love it. I love it.
It's definitely close to me. And I think, it's been a long time now. Collectively, this has been almost as long as as Jet, which we worked on for so long, and it becomes so much a part of me, and even like the evolution of like 8 years into a project, going back and being like, oh, I'm working on a song that started 8 or 10 years ago. Well, with
Amazing.
Jet, one of those, I think I mentioned this, is a remix of something I did in like 2001.
Yeah.
So it was like 20 years of time passed in between starting something and that iteration. I don't even want to say finishing, but that iteration, we're kind of there with Oxenfree stuff because the earliest dates on Oxenfree projects for me are in 2014, like very end of
Okay.
2014. We're
Yeah.
coming up on years of I think Atwater Station or Arcadia Station would be kind of like the most recent iteration on something that started in 2014.
Wow.
So, time
Well,
loops with loops.
yep. Here's looking for another 9 or 10 years of Oxenfree. I'd be okay with that.
I would be too. I love it. I have no I think this is rare too. I mentioned not liking music that it's done,
Mm-hmm.
but that as a component of larger projects, I'm super proud of it and not sick of any of it. Like I
Yeah. Good.
really that I get to look back fondly and be like, oh yeah, this game rules, and I love how they use this music, and
Mm-hmm.
pretty universally across everything I've done.
When we talked earlier, you mentioned, you're working on things you can't talk about, which good. Hooray. Anything you're working on that you can talk about?
You know what? No, because
Okay.
it used to be there was always something cooking that was announced, but now since I'm only working on night school projects, I think it's, you know, pretty obvious we're working on something else. And until it's announced, yeah, that is in the vault. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, so on work is definitely in progress and ongoing because we overlap. It's not like we finished Oxenfree 2 and we're like, okay, what are we doing next? Like, we already have something else
Yep.
uh in process, but then it's just, video games. So it's hard to say like, oh, I can't wait. In 6 months we get to talk about this. Like
Yeah.
it's all top secret and in flux, just like all video game stuff is. So
Hmm.
yeah, nothing I can disclose.
Well, at least there's
Um,
something there. That's good.
yeah, I think the closest is I the final non-night school thing that I had done, which was a series of games for Tender Claws. It was virtual reality and
Yeah.
VVR. Finally got those together and put those on Bandcamp last week, and so
I
those will
saw
be
that.
Spotify and whatnot soon. Um, so yeah, so I guess there's a whole new soundtrack to pre-existing games that is just getting announced now, just
Nice.
because it was such a mammoth project to compile for tons of reasons. One, there's so much music between the games, but also, yeah, this is for a whole nother podcast. But VVR1, one of the conceits of it was it takes place in this pseudo corporate universe where this corporation controls everything. So the vast majority of the music is based on one melody.
Oh,
So
wow.
parse how to make a soundtrack that just wasn't repetitive guck for over and over because it's like, what's the shitty corporate lobby waiting room music version of this? What's the
Wow.
poppy uh pharmaceutical ad version of this? And just did that over and over. It's like nobody wants to hear that over and over and over. So it took a long time to like carve it into a soundtrack that made sense as something people would like listen to
Hmm.
without being annoyed. But yeah,
Hmm.
story for another day. But that's the most recent like thing. That was
Hmm.
last week, and then like I said, Spotify, it'll pop up there soon as well.
Okay.
And then yeah, believe that's the last thing floating pre night school
Okay.
for me. Everything else is out in the wild or long ago canceled and buried, which there's plenty of that.
Yeah.
A lot
Do
of music.
you own any of that music or is it all buried?
I do. I
Okay.
believe. I don't think I've done, I think I've been really good about my contracts reverting rights to anything unused, then is mine.
Okay.
So yeah, so bubbles up for other projects, but then I do always have this like in the back of my mind, like, oh, I'll compile it and like put it on Bandcamp just because it is. But also that's really difficult because it is just scraps of different styles and things.
Yeah. What do you think about, the soundtrack experience, like taking the music you made for the game and making it into a soundtrack? Do you find that enjoyable, or is it kind of tedious, or what do you think about that process?
It can be tedious for sure. I don't mind it, I'm just used to doing everything DIY. So like VVR was the toughest, like I mentioned, the reason, but just because it's like so much music, like 39 songs, and that's even edited down, getting rid of stuff like, nobody wants to hear this kind of stuff. But it's just something I put up with. But like at least for Oxenfree 2, I got to use a real mastering engineer, so that helped relieve some of that pressure. But it's a lot of work. Like sequencing, arranging properly, mixing properly, then the mastering and getting everything prepped can take a ton of time. Yeah. If I didn't care much, it'd be way easier. But like I said, with VVR and VVR2 was like making it a sensible like whole took a long time. Progress since, I don't know, VVR2 came out sometime last year. So yeah, it's been a long, tedious process, but also like it's not that I get tired of it or sick of it. It's just that there isn't enough hours in the day to like focus and make it right.
Yeah.
Because every single second of music, then I have to like review for mixes, errors. If there's an error, I gotta fix it. Or if I decide to make a mix change after listening on like earbuds because something's too short, all of that stuff then is a loop that is several times as long as how long that piece of music is, because to review it again, gotta listen to it from beginning to end. And yeah.
Yep. Well, Andy, I love your shit, man.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Yeah, this is what are we on? We're over 2 hours now. Whew.
I know. I suspected, but I didn't want to assume that we'd chat that long. When I first started doing this show, well, I can't even say that because there was a time in my past where this was a 5-minute show. That's long time ago when making it for somebody else. But then for a while there, I was like 45 minutes. That's my max. I can't sit and talk to anybody for more than 45 minutes. Luckily, I grew out of that. But now I do try to keep it to an hour, because I think for an episode, because once I add music, that could add like 10 more minutes to it, right? If I'm adding 30-second chunks every once in a while of music. But I kind of figured this might be a long one, like our first chat when we talked about Jet and Gibbon. So yeah, I'm grateful.
And happy to talk, and those are my favorite, are deep dives as well.
Yeah,
it was really, really fascinating. Yeah. And especially for projects that are so long, it's actually fun to like dig, with your help, like dig up memories of things like, oh yeah, I forgot about this. And like, yeah. Or like the ones where I literally, maybe I'll get back to you with like the clean slate, a more solid answer on that. Totally just like, so long ago, I don't remember.
It's great. I've loved it all. So thank you so much for everything.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. This is one of the interviews I wanted to make sure happened.